Welcome to the first of 5 sessions focused on looking at the challenges and solutions for the real estate market. I'm joined here today with esteemed colleague from JLL, and we'll do introduction shortly. But the topic that we'll be talking about today is sustainability impact. How can we make sustainability impact in the real estate industry, but also really merging the two things that are so important, the ambitions and the things that we put inside of a strategy to the action that needs to take place to reach 2050 goals by all companies. So today we're going to look at how property professionals are tackling emissions reductions head on in a challenging environment. So I'm joined by Juliette Madonna, the head of sustainability consulting at JLL. And Juliette, will you introduce yourself for the group?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Mike. I'm very happy to be there today. And so my name is Juliette Madonna. I am working within JLL, and so I am leading the sustainability consulting activities that we have across EMEAs. And so happy to share, also how we support investors, occupiers, etc., into their transition in decarbonization today.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm Mike Haswazak, the CMO of Digital Energy, where I lead the global strategy for buildings of the future and focusing on all the values across sustainability, resiliency, efficiency, and people centricity. But again, today we're going to focus on the impacts of decarbonization sustainability, but also how that plays a role in everything else that we do around the building. So just to kick us off, let's take a look at what we need to do to tackle the building decarbonization market. And there's 2 parts to this equation. The first part is looking at operational emissions. And operational emissions is the bulk of the emissions that are inside a building. And if you think about that, that's the emissions that are tied to everything as far as energy usage, also anything that's tied to anything that's on the operation and maintain phase of the life cycle. The second part of the emissions is tied to design and build. And that's the embodied emissions that's tied to the construction of the building itself. It represents a smaller portion, but this is a big part of what we need to start to look at. How do we balance these 2 things? And how do we look at opportunities to reduce operational emissions while still continuing to keep a low profile on the embodied emissions of a building? So today's discussion will really focus on that part of the emissions, the operational emissions. So some of the things that we'll talk about today is really what do we need to do to act now? How do we bridge the gap between the ambition to action? And so, Juliette, I think it would be great if you can share with the group a little bit about the challenges and the insights of the market today. We have a few around climate, obviously, the built environment representing 37% of the global emissions. But also, there's other factors as well, like financial factors that we want to make sure that we don't have, stranded assets, and making sure that people are looking at this seriously to be competitive in the market. And then the last part of that is regulatory measures. What's happening today by government and policies to really drive the need for change in the built environment. So, Juliette, can you tell me a little bit about what you're seeing in the market and some of those insights?
Yeah, sure. So I think that you've listed a key element, I would say. Huge pressure from regulation. So we are still in a very complex environment, but we see progressive alignment at global level with a global standard. And then also at national and city level, we see more and more some regulation on business and on building performance, etc., that are adding pressure not only on investor, but progressively also on the occupier. So clearly pressure from regulation. Then I would say when we look at, climate and financial perspective, for sure we've seen some barriers related to the high rate, low activity on capital markets, etc., that in terms of move forward into action that have not necessarily gave the right signal to accelerate this implementation. And this is why, in the building sector, we are still quite low in this move to action. I would say the good news is if you look at the global commitment, it's now moving at scale. So 66%, I would say, of the Fortune 500 are committed to climate change. What it means is that progressively, it's translating not only to their core business activities, but also on their building, what they want to do. And so they are, progressively integrating in their requirements much more ESG, like performance requirements, which means that when we look at the supply and demand market, we are progressively arriving on a leasing market at a tipping point. I would say in 2025, so like next year, 30% of the demand for low carbon building by corporate on leasing will not be met by the market. The market is under supply. When you make the projection by 2030, at the current pace of retrofit, which is about 1% per year right now, we arrive at 70% of gap between supply and demand. So which means that we are arriving to, a situation that I'm calling the tipping point, where it gives a signal for investor of what is the value shift in lease, in value, liquidity of the assets, etc., for them to move into action. It also move in, I would say, a relocation strategy or adjustment of location strategy from the corporate that are progressively integrating ESG in their requirement. And so all of this, I would say maybe the third thing I would say is like it's creating a shared incentive between investor and the occupier to move collectively into action. And so we start to see those materialization in the lease, etc. So, I think that this is moving in the right direction. I would say that, between 2025, 2026, probably we're going to arrive where there is an acceleration, and potentially even a bottleneck in this move to action.
No, it's really good to hear that we're at the tipping point. So it means that we're going in the right direction. And just to tie into that, I think one of the opportunities that we see obviously in the market right now is to look at the renovation market and the potential there. And so, something to share is that 50% of the buildings that exist today will exist in 2050, which is a huge opportunity to act now. It's also the date and target for most organizations' net zero ambitions. So this is really a motivation to move fast, and there's a place really to start to take action. When you look at an existing building, it represents a huge amount of emissions, both the embodied and operational emissions. And if you look at a new build, it's about 0.51 million tons of CO2. And lastly, if you look at a retrofit, it's about 0.28 million tons of CO2. What's staggering about this is that a retrofit is about half of the emissions of a new build or new construction. And a retrofit is about 1/6 of an existing build, which means there's huge potential to look at our existing building stock and to see how we can help our customers renovate with sustainability in mind, but also really thinking about what is the potential for us to accelerate in this area. And I think Juliette was mentioning a little bit about acceleration. We see that, and we see more people taking action on those ambitions, but we need to go even 3 times faster to hit our 2050 targets. And so one part of this is how do we start to implement the right steps and the right measures to get started? And that journey is something that allows us to not only get started, but think about what are those low-hanging fruits for people to start to tackle. So part of that is a technology-first approach. When you think about it, technology presents an opportunity for low upfront carbon emissions, so you're not adding additional carbon. You're also looking at the opportunity to get a quicker return on investment rather than doing a deeper renovation. So we look at 3 phases of renovation today. So light interventions for compliance and efficiency, which is minimal disruption. So if you think about it, you want to make sure that your occupants are still within the building, you're still having tenants there, but also making sure that part of what you're doing is going to bring value to the asset itself. The second part of this is looking at a deeper level of renovation, which is are medium retrofits. And this is where we start to introduce things like electrification and renewables. So we're getting a higher, I would say, carbon reduction inside the building itself, but we also have still minimal disruptions, but the impact is much larger. And it's also helpful to help with competing in the market. And the last part of this is looking at deep renovations. And deep renovations obviously are extensive. They take time. They're also very costly. And so the return on investment is much lower. And it takes a longer time to get that back. The opportunity here is for us to take a look at how do we get started that journey today, and different customers are at different points. And so always starting with a light intervention, which is less disruptive, and also I would say not only that, but with quicker return on investments, a good way to go. So Juliette, tell me a little bit about what you're seeing in the market around renovation today, and what are you doing to help customers?
Yeah, so I would say, clear on like these 3 steps, I would say what is key to understand is like there is no one solution for all. It's like trying also to understand, based on the building, what is the type of fabric, etc., what is the MEP system, etc., and then try to see what is like the proper renovation that is required to move forward. I would say when we look at, once again, back to the occupier, what they are looking for in terms of best practice is something like 70 kilowatt hour per square meter, which at the minimum would require like a medium retrofit. So we need to go to the MEP to be able to, tackle this type of requirement. And then when we think about the deeper renovation, etc., it's where for sure it makes sense also to look at the usage of the building. And so when we move to this level is like how we can potentially reposition the building, because if we need to go through this type of retrofit, it's also to think about, by repositioning globally the asset, how we can get value. And so to facilitate this move to action, and this is really what we do with investor as well with occupier, is like to map, based on the portfolio, what is the proper type of retrofit which is required, what are the costs, but then also what is the value impact, right? Because, in all market, the supply and demand market is not there. The demand is not the same everywhere. And then what we need to, create in terms of value may be different. So this is really by linking, all of this in terms of cost, work, path to decarbonization with the value that we manage to make those things move forward.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think there's still many factors that go into why people are renovating, but we see much more of it tied now back to obviously the ambitions to achieve their net zero targets. So part of this also is looking at those technologies that are available today, but the impacts those technologies play. And so the previous slide shared a little bit about the light interventions and the medium retrofits and deep renovation, but approximately 42% of emissions, operational emissions, can be reduced just by taking the first steps of light interventions. And what that means is looking specifically at building management systems as well as power management systems. And part of that journey is looking at how do you take the first steps of looking at the energy consumption and monitoring that before you get into the next phase of looking at how do you manage that to decrease the emissions. When you look at medium retrofits, this provides an additional 28% of reduction of emissions. So that gets us to about 70% of the total emissions that can be reduced just through technology alone. And then if you're going deeper into the renovation itself, which is sometimes necessary to get to full net zero, it looks at things like electrifying heating and the building envelope itself. So a lot of potential really to get started today with quick return on investment. And finding the right partner for that is extremely important. So that way somebody can help you go through that journey, like Juliette said, to identify really the right assets to tackle this on, and then move forward on how to continue to build into the action plan and the solutions that will help with reducing the emissions. So if we want to go to the next slide. What we've done is we've identified 10 top priorities for net zero buildings. And so I'll walk you through this in a very high level, but this is, I would say, a game plan for any organization to take either at individual building level or looking at a set of buildings in a portfolio. You always need to start with strategize and having a really good strategy in place to really understand where you need to go and what you want to achieve. And part of this is having a really good baseline, being able to measure from a starting point and then working towards making sure that you're reducing. Digitizing is also an important part of this as well, because part of getting the visibility is digitizing those things that you don't have visibility to today. And that visibility will allow you to understand better what are the wastes that you have today, especially on the energy management side or the energy that you're wasting, and where you can reduce even further before you get into decarbonization. And when we look at decarbonization, it's not only about introducing renewables as well as electrification, but it's about how do we look at this more holistically to optimize the energy management and control it in a much better way. So these are our, I would say, 10 priorities for any building owner operator to take into consideration when they're looking at how to decarbonize their building. And Juliette, what do you think is the opportunity here, around strategy all the way to decarbonize for customers that you've seen?
Yeah, so I would say that basically, this suite of solutions clearly make, the trajectory toward net zero. So then what we really try to do is to help clients to strategically plan across their portfolio, all of this, because there is also a question of timing, like depending on is the building occupied, is not occupied, when there is an expiration of the lease, etc. So basically to be able to make this happen, I would say this is where by looking at portfolio and helping to make a strategic planning to make sure that we also take into account, for example, capital investment that are already planned where we can synchronize. And so to, for example, consider the cost to decarbonize, just take the marginal cost versus all what is already planned, etc. Really help to mitigate, I would say, the investment required. So this is one key thing. And then once again, what I was saying before is like, there is a clear shared incentive between occupier and investor to work on it. So then it's like how we facilitate this, I would say, co-investment where, each party take advantage of its own benefit, but be, I would say, synchronized in how they can collectively move forward. So I think that this is all, I would say, the technicality, and then we need to factor, I would say, the real life of project and building life cycle to see how then we can strategically plan this through, the portfolio and the time.
Yeah. Having a good roadmap is important. I think the other part of this is obviously that decarbonization and sustainability is absolutely a journey. It's not something that you start and stop, and it's something that you need to continuously improve and optimize, especially when you're looking at operational emissions inside of a building. So lots of opportunities here. I think this is the last set of slides, but I think what I would love to understand, Juliette, from your side, as you're helping customers, some are already on their journey for achieving their targets. Some are just getting started. And so some of those that are just getting started, what are some of the things that you think are important for them to know, or what are the actions they should take to get started?
Yes, I would say indeed, we see different maturity across all clients. I think that among some of the barriers, there is one thing which comes quite frequently is a question of data, especially in building, like it's to be able to move forward. We want to get some data and have some reliable data, but also basically when you wait to have the perfect data, it's where you never move to action because we know we'll never have the perfect data. So it's how you manage to combine a continuous improvement process in terms of data collection to be able to prioritize, to work, to report to the market, but also how you are able to be pretty pragmatic in your strategic planning to also move to action. So I think this is a key element around data that is super important. And then the second thing that I wanted to, re-emphasize is the collaboration. So collaboration between two acts, collaboration, I think, between investor and occupier, and we really try to facilitate this, but also collaboration in the value chain. So I think that, globally, the building value chain is quite late in this move to action, and this is where I would say understanding the solution provider and understanding, what is possible from a technology innovation perspective, so that when we make the strategic planning at the beginning, we also are able to factor all of this is something, which is super important. So we try also, to facilitate those connections across the value chain to make sure that as an industry, I would say we are moving forward in the right direction.
No, those are perfect. And I think just to add to, I think the collaboration is essential. I think partnership is something that we need to continue to work through, and having the ecosystem work together. We can't solve this alone. We need each other. So, technology players working together, occupants working, government, everybody working together to help solve for this. And I think that's an important part of it. And then the other part is really thinking about, what do we have today? We have technologies that are available today to help us get started. And I think that's a great place to take action, especially looking at opportunities to manage your power and energy better, but also thinking about opportunities to optimize on the management of the building. And these are low-hanging fruits that have a quick return on investment. So I think today, having the right partner in that journey is going to be essential, especially because of the fact that, going through, sustainability and decarbonization, it's not something you start and stop. You want someone that's going to be on the long road with you. And so that's an important part of that. So I want to thank Juliette for her the opportunity to speak with you today and have you part of our session. And thank you to the audience for attending.
Thank you.